Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at game number 5 of the World Chess Championship match being played between Jan Nepomniachtchi from Russia and Ding Lirean from China. Now, as you guys know, after drawing game number 3, Ding won in game 4 to tie the match up at 2 games apiece. So game 5 being played today, let's jump right into the action. So here we go. So of course, Jan playing with the white pieces, Ding playing with the black pieces, and the game starts out with e4. We get e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5 being played here, and now we get a6, all very standard so far. Bishop a4, knight to f6, castles. Now this is the first big difference in the match. In the first game of the match, Jan played the move bishop takes c6, and of course we had the classic deferred or delayed variation of the exchange Spanish. So in this game we get castles. Ding plays bishop e7, and here we have d3 being played, and this of course is the closed variation of the Spanish, where white plays d3 instead of playing the more traditional move rook e1. Now I suspect that Jan simply did not want to go back into more of these anti-martial variations. He played both a4 as well as h3 in his previous world championship match against Magnus Carlsen, but again, very fixed, very finite setups, and I think he wanted to try to spring a surprise. So we get d3 here. Ding plays b5, and now we get the move bishop to b3. d6 is played here. We get c3, castles, and now this important move h3. This is an important move, as generally in the Spanish, white tries to fight for the center by building a pawn chain from b2 to d4 and getting these pawns on e4 and d4 when possible. Also worth noting that generally if you try to play, like, let's just say rook e1 for example, I'm just going to make a move like rook e8, d4 here. Black can play bishop g4 and put pressure on the knight on f3. There's a very nasty pin, and both d4 and e4 can come under fire very soon. So h3 is played by Jan here to stop bishop to g4. We get bishop to b7 instead. a4 played here. Now this has all been played before, but a4 is already starting to venture towards some unknown territory. There are a couple of games that have been played in this line by top GMs, but here normally white will play something like knight bd2, knight to a5, bishop c2, c5, and now a move like rook to e1 with the idea of knight to f1, knight to g3, or knight to e3. So here we get a4 being played. Now the idea for Nepo is he wants to open up the a file potentially. He also wants to create a very important square for the bishop here on a2 after knight a5 is played, because now the bishop is always keeping an eye on this pawn on f7 and the king on g8, whereas if you have to put the bishop on c2 for example, now the bishop is simply behind pawns here. It's not really doing a whole lot on this diagonal, so a4 is a way of keeping the bishop on this more important diagonal towards the king on g8. Game continues with c5. We get bishop to g5. Now this is a novelty as far as I know, first time it's ever been played. Up to this point, all the moves are coming in pretty fast and furious from both players, but Jan decides to play this move, and the idea is actually quite simple. What white wants to do here is that after h6 is played in the game, he simply wants to trade the bishop for the knight on f6, trade the pawns on b5, and play knight bd2. Now again, it doesn't really look very logical on first glance because black has the bishop pair. Now as I've said before, generally the bishop pair is advantageous at the top level if your opponent has, say, a bishop and knight in return for the 2 bishops, but here it's a little bit different for a couple of reasons. First of all, when we look at the pawn structure, the black bishop is behind a couple of pawns, so the bishop on f6 is not super active here. Additionally, because of the pawn structure with the pawns on d6, c5, and e5, white can try to jump with the knight to d5. So let's just say I play some random waiting moves. Down the road, I want to bring this knight to e3, and if I can, I even want to trade the light square bishops and get this great outpost for the knight on d5. And even here, say knight d5, even if you get a position like this, the bishop is really powerful on d5. So white has an advantage here, and it's primarily because of the black pawn structure with these 3 pawns. So knight c6 is played by Ding. Nepo plays bishop d5 instantly, and here the rooks get traded. Now again, not going to go too deep into the weeds of possibilities, but I do feel like in this position it was possible to play a move like queen to b6, try to trade the rooks, and then go rook over to a from f8. At any rate, rook takes a1 is played. We get queen takes a1, queen to d7. Nepo continues to move instantly, plays rook e1, and by this point, as you guys can tell, Ding is already down half an hour on the clock. Game continues with rook a8. We get queen to d1, bishop to d8. Now this move is just a conceptual idea by Ding. What he wants to do is he wants to put the bishop on b6 because the bishop on f6 is not doing a whole lot. White really can't force in d4 here. Black is already overprotecting the square with 2 pawns and a knight, so d4 is not an idea. Additionally, if d4 is not an idea, bishop simply has no scope on this diagonal from f6 towards h4 or towards this d8 square. So because of that, Ding plays bishop d8. We get knight to f1, and now we get this move knight e7. Now after the game, one of the commentators on the official stream, Daniil Dubov, felt that this was the positional blunder of the game, and I do tend to agree with Daniil when he says this, because in this position black has the bishop pair. Now it's worth noting white wants to jump with the knight to the center of the board, but black does not need to trade off these bishops. Instead, what Ding should have played was a move like bishop c8, and after say knight to e3, he should have moved the rook to, let's just say, a7. I think a7, a6, and b8 are all pretty similar, but the point is quite clear. When white plays a move like queen to d2, for example, black can now go knight to e7, putting pressure on the bishop on d5. If the bishop has to move away, black can now go bishop b7, and white simply cannot take advantage of this d5 square. Black is protecting it with both the bishop and the knight. So Ding, of course, here probably a little bit rattled. I can't be too critical of his play throughout this game, because once again, it is a world championship match. He's feeling confident, feeling good, but more importantly, his opponent is blitzing out every single move. So Ding plays knight e7. Now, like I said, this doesn't lose the game, but once the light square bishops come off the board and white's able to play knight e3, white is definitely a little bit better here, because white can push for d4 while also having the knight on e3, protecting the d5 and f5 squares. Very hard for black to break. And so because of the lack of the break, potential blockade or outpost, I should say, on d5 and or jumping to f5, combined with a central pawn break, all the trumps here are in white's favor. Now the game continues with bishop b6. Ding showing why he put the bishop on d8. What he wants to do is push the pawn to c4 and open up scope on the long diagonal toward this knight on e3 and the pawn on f2. Game continues with h4. Now this move was played after a 7-minute think by Nepo. Now I don't know if Nepo played h4 because of prep or whether he was just moving quickly. My assumption is that Nepo had probably seen similar positions in his preparation over the last couple of months. Maybe not this exact position, but probably a very similar situation. Let's just say where black plays like knight a5 and there's a trade of bishops, and maybe white goes h4 h5 here. So while I think at this point Nepo was out of prep, he plays h4 because I think he had seen it in similar situations in his pre-game preparations. So we get h4, queen c6 is played, and now Nepo plays this move h5 after quite a bit of a think, or about 15 minutes. Now in the post-game press conference, Nepo said this was probably the hardest decision of the game. He was trying to decide between playing pawn to h5 or pawn to c4. Now when you look at this position, you're probably wondering, well, what's the point of pushing the pawn? Now the reason that you want to push this pawn to h5 is you want to create a bastion for the knight on f5. At the same time, in this position, it's very tricky, because if you play c4, the bishop is locked behind the pawn chain. So it's a very tough decision, and Nepo ultimately plays h5. Now c4 was a move that would have made some sense, but after a move like bishop to a5, rook to e2, and b takes c4, it's already getting a little bit tricky, because if you take with the pawn here, black can simply go bishop c7, and you have a weak pawn on e4. You don't really want to play knight d5, because after the trade you no longer have the square in the center on d5 for your knight, so you don't really want to do that. If you say play like a move like queen d3, for example, black can play queen b7, and now you have this weakness on b2. Let's say you go b3, black can even play rook to a3, or potentially play knight c6 and get his own potential bastion with knight d4 down the road as well. So very tricky situation, but ultimately Nepo makes the right decision and he plays h5. Idea very simple here. You want to go knight to h4, and then you want to put a knight on f5, and ultimately this is going to result in a very bad situation for black, because you get queen g4, all kinds of mate threats towards g7, h6 is weak as well, and now the pawn on h5 makes perfect sense. So if we go back a few moves just to illustrate the point, if you play knight h4 here, black can simply play g6, stopping you from ever jumping with the knight to f5. Whereas once you're able to get this pawn up to h5, let's say queen b7, knight h4 is played. If you go g6 here, I simply trade, I bring the queen out. The pawn on g6 is very, very weak here. Let's say king h7, white can go knight d5, and now black is in all kinds of trouble. If you take the knight, you lose the pawn here, and this of course is simply winning for white. And if you play a move like rook g8 to guard the pawn, then there's knight f6 check, forking the king and the rook. So it's already very, very critical here, and Ding plays c4. Now c4, very thematic move, trying to open up the scope for the bishop. Nepomniachtchi plays he plays pawn to d4 here, and now we get this move pawn takes pawn, played by Ding after a long think. Now in my opinion, I think this was a critical blunder. It was sort of the start of going in the wrong direction here. When I was doing my live analysis of the game in real time, I felt that both rook to d8 here as well as queen c7 were better moves, simply because you don't break the tension. If you play rook to d8, for example, if white ever trades, now black has an open d file for the rook. Let's just say queen takes e4 is good. play queen b1, black can go move like pawn to f6 and rook to d3 as well. And with this great bishop on b6 combined with the control over the d file and the weak pawn here in the center, black is clearly for choice. Additionally, queen c7 is also a reasonable move because now it's not clear how white proves an advantage. White could try knight h4 for example, but after takes and queen d7 you get this very scary knight on f5. But after takes and a move like king to, I don't know which square, let's just say h7, queen to g4 being played in this position, black can now play the move bishop takes d4, guarding the pawn. You can't capture the bishop because then you lose your queen on g4. So already here it feels very scary from a distance. Also even a move like rook to e3 going rook g3, but computers simply don't care. They'll play like queen e6, rook g3, and even just rook to g8, and white does not really have much of an attack, even though it looks very scary. That being said, of course, Ding instead decides to play the very committal move pawn takes pawn. Now I think the reason Ding played this is twofold. First of all, I think Ding thought that now white cannot really take with the pawn on d4 because after a move like b4 and c3 potentially, black should have more than enough compensation here. He's going to get a passed pawn on c file, should not be in any real danger. So I think Ding, when he played this, he realized that c takes d4 wasn't a move, and he thought that after knight takes d4, now this diagonal is completely open. Sure, there's some knights in the way, but this diagonal can never be closed, whereas here, temporarily at least, bishop can put pressure on the pawn in d4, but the diagonal is closed here. So when he takes on d4, he realized, I think, that Nepo couldn't capture with the pawn. And after knight takes d4, queen c5, he figured, okay, the bishop will always have targets on this diagonal. Now it's worth noting, of course, that black cannot capture this pawn on e4 because of the clean fossil with knight takes pawn. Rook attacks the queen, knight attacks the bishop. When black moves the queen, you trade everything off, and after all the trades, white simply has one extra pawn here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. So white's up a pawn. So after we get the trade, queen c5 is played. Here Nepo plays queen g4. Now this move is a slight mistake. In this position, what Nepo should have played was queen f3, and the reason is actually very basic. It's because after black plays a move like queen to e5, you can go knight g4. If queen h5, you have knight f6, creating the classic fossil, and you win the game. And if black plays queen g5, you can now open up the diagonal to e5. Queen attacks the rook, and after say d5 e6, white is definitely better here. Well, I guess actually in this one you take on b5, and the other one you play e6, but white is better. They're probably like, okay, but who cares? I mean, what's the difference? Queen g4 is fine, but the problem is when you play queen g4 and queen e5 occurs, now you no longer have knight g4. You can't open up this diagonal, and knight f5 here is actually not doing anything at all, because after takes and king h7, now the bishop on b6 is very powerful. You have the weak pawn on f2. Queen guards g7, black can play rook a2, attack on the 7th rank. Even g6 might be a move down the road, and black is better. So here Nepo plays knight f3, you get queen e6, and now knight to f5. And what you'll notice here is that the big difference is that in this position, the knight on f3 is actually nowhere near as effective as it would have been on e3. If you were to put the queen on f3, you'll notice that you can use this knight to go to d5 or f5, but you can also use the knight on d4. So because the knight's on e3, it has more squares that are available. Whereas in the game here, after knight f5, the knight on f3 just isn't a very active piece. So after knight f5 threatening checkmate, here Ding makes a big mistake. He trades the knights on f5. Maybe that takes isn't actually a mistake, but as Ding alluded to after the game, he felt that he should have played queen f6, guarding against the checkmate on g7, but also guarding the knight on e7. And black is completely fine here because this bishop on b6 is significantly better than the knight on f3. Let's say we get a trade. You'll notice that even if white goes knight h4, queen f6, knight f5, once again black can play a move like rook a2, and with this very powerful bishop, black is definitely a little bit better. So instead Ding trades, and now he makes a huge mistake. He plays this move queen f6. Now again, very hard to fault Ding. I suspect that he didn't realize that queen d7 was a better move. I also suspect that Ding probably after queen d7 was very worried about queen to e4, and if you play a move like, let's just say rook to d8, white can actually play f6 here, trying to attack on the king side. Play a move like d5, white goes queen h4. You have some issues with the pawns. Now computer again thinks it's okay after a move like queen f5, but considering the stakes, considering the situation, king feels a little bit loose here. It's understandable why he didn't want to allow this. So after queen d7, queen e4, queen e4, black can actually play d5, and if white plays queen e7, you simply trade and play a move like b4. You have rook a1 incoming here. You have the pawns in the center that are starting to push down the board, and black is in no way, shape, or form worse. So instead Ding plays queen f6, which is a big mistake, and after this move white is clearly better. So Nepo plays queen e4, we get rook to b8, and now we have rook e2, another excellent move played by Nepo. Now it may not be the only move here. During my live analysis I thought g4 was also playable, but the reason rook e2 is so important here is that now if black plays b4, you can simply capture the juicer. Whereas if you were to play a move like g4 and b4 occurs, you cannot capture because now black wins the pawn on b2, and the pawns on both b4 and f2 are very weak. So here rook e2 is an excellent move because b4 is not playable. We got bishop c5, and now this move g4 is played. Now it was very surprising to me after the game in the press conference to hear that Ding was saying that he essentially missed g4. He thought that at this point basically he was already equal. Let's just say white plays king h2. Black can now go b4. If you trade the pawns, black can simply take here, and with the weak pawn on b2, if you ever capture on c4, you lose f5. If you play like king g1, bishop c5, now b2 is super weak, and probably the game should end in a draw. So g4 is apparently what Ding was claiming that he missed, because after g4, black can no longer play b4, because now when you take on c4 after the trade, the pawn on f5 is simply guarded by the pawn on g4. So this is what Ding said he missed, was basically missed that in all these positions after queen c4 there's queen f5, whereas once white goes g4, now you can never play b4 without losing a free pawn on c4. So after g4 we get queen d8 played by Ding. Nepo plays queen d5, stopping black from pushing the pawn, but more importantly black's pieces are very, very passive. The bishop on c5 is targeting the pawn on f2, but it also is not really threatening it because white is guarding it with both the rook and the king. Additionally, b4 hangs c4, and you can't even play d5, so now there are going to be some problems with either f6 or g5 down the road on the king side, and the bishop looks really nice, but it's just a very bad piece. So the game continues with king f8. We get king f1, which apparently is a blunder. Nepo should have played king g2 here, but the reason that he didn't play king g2 is he's probably saw queen c8 and he thought that if f6 you hang the pawn on g4 with check. So Nepo goes king f1. Now the reason this is apparently wrong is after king g2, queen c8, king g3, queen to b7, the show goes on with queen d2, and white is apparently close to winning due to f6 ideas, undermining the black pawns on the king side, and if f6 you get knight h4 with knight g6, and white should be a little bit better. But after going king to f1 here, what Nepo thought he had is now if queen c8 is played, he wanted to go f6, and if queen takes g4 you have rook e7, winning the game on the spot because the h5 pawn is guarded by the queen. The queen targets f7, and it's simply checkmate on f7. You can play queen h3, king e2, but unless you give away your queen here on either h5 or the e6 squares, you are going to be checkmated in the next couple of moves. Now the reason Ding didn't do this, of course, is that after f6 he would have had to take, and after queen to e4, king g8, computer thinks that after knight h4 and queen b7, black is apparently only slightly worse. Now for us humans looking at the position where white is getting this great bastion with the knight on f5, black's pawns are terrible, it's very hard to believe that this isn't just lost from a distance, but the computer does think that this is holdable. Ding, however, like most of us, plays rook c8 because he thought the whole queen c8 f6 line was losing, but now after rook c8 and rook to e4, another excellent move, black is in fact losing here because now you simply don't have any good moves. If you play a move like queen c7 here, for example, now after f6, let's just say you take and queen d2 is played, king g8, you can simply take the pawn here, and after d5, rook f4, this rook is very active, the knight is going to g5 in a move or two, and it's a complete disaster. Additionally, another very important point behind rook e4 is if black plays queen d7 to try and trade the queens, you have knight to e5, queen to c7, and now you have this crushing move, knight g6. If black plays king g8, there are many ways to win, but rook e7 is the cleanest. Knight guards the rook, queen on d5 wins the pawn on f7, absolute disaster on the 7th rank. And if black captures on g6, you take with the f pawn, and rook f4 followed by some form of a checkmate is simply unstoppable. One sample line is queen d7, you go check, king to e7, rook f7 check, king d8 takes check, king c6, queen g7. White has all these pawns on the king side, they're just rolling right up the board, and white will win the game. So instead we get rook to b8 because at this point you don't really have many moves. Ding has to either play rook b8, king g8, or just resign the game. So he goes rook b8, we get g5 here. Now this is also crushing move played fast by Nepo here. Nepo not using a lot of time, but spotting all the basic tactical themes. Now this move essentially ends the game. You're probably wondering, well, why does it say question mark? And that's because at low depth, the low depth stockfish on chess.com does not realize that this is in fact the winning game, as the supercomputer Sessa proved on its own website. So after g5 we get pawn takes pawn, rook to g4. Now really at this point it's already lost. You can play queen d7 takes, for example, but here after a move like knight to d4, ideas like f6, knight c6, etc., white is just completely winning, and that's mainly due to the black king being very, very poorly placed. So we get h takes g5, we get rook g4 here, and Ding plays rook a8. Now you probably think, well, just f6, guard the weak pawn. But if you play f6, now the white pony jumps into the game with knight to h4, threatening to go to g6. Now if you don't take the knight, you're getting mated. One example is queen d7, knight g6, king e8, and queen g8 checkmate. And so you probably have to take, I mean, maybe there's some way to run with king e7, but actually queen e6 and knight g6 is also checkmate, so it's just hopeless. And when you capture the pony on h4, now white plays h6. If you take, it's mate in 2. And if you don't take and you play a move like queen e7, now I just slide the pawn to h7. I'm getting a second queen on the board with the h8 queen, and it's just hopeless, totally hopeless. So Ding, after a long think here, plays rook a8. Again, at this point the game is effectively over. We get rook a8, knight takes g5, threatening mate on f7. We get rook a1 check, king e2, trying for Jan's best attempt at trying to emulate the Bond cloud. We get queen e7, knight to e4 is played, and you're probably wondering, well, materials even, how can the computer say it's so much better? The reason is simply there are too many threats on the king side. One very basic threat, it's not even the best threat, but one of the basic threats, I can take on g7 and fork the king and the queen here, and I'm simply winning this position. This is problem number 1. Now problem number 2 is that additionally I can always play f6 and again slide this h-pawn down the board and get a second queen. So already here it's just over. Now Ding tries to fight on valiantly, but it's basically without any hope. He plays queen e8. We get king to f3, just a quiet waiting move here that's played to sidestep any threats on the e file. Here we get queen to a8 played. Now again, just nothing you can do. Even if you play rook f1, the pawn is guarded on f2, so white can even play king g2, rook e1, and once again f6 takes rook g8 is a nice little trick that wins the game. And even without that, even here you can also just go f6, which is completely winning. So Ding plays queen 8, trying to trade the queens, get into an endgame, maybe save it. But unfortunately, even after the queen trade and f6 is played, it's still lost. If you play g takes f6, which is one line, white can simply take king to e7, knight g8, king f8, and now white starts pushing p with h6. You go f5, and after rook to, I think all roads lead to Rome, but let's just say rook g1 here, the game is over because black cannot really stop this pawn. If you move the king, I go h7, rook covers the square, pawn guards the knight, pawn will become a queen on the next turn. You also don't have bishop d4 because the square is covered by the pawn on c3. If you play rook to a7 trying to stop the pawn, now I go knight to f6, rook to f7, and simply h7 making a queen, or you have to give up the rook on h7 for the pawn, and you lose the game as well. So Ding plays g6 here, pawn trades, rook takes, and now he goes rook a2, again hoping to win this pawn, maybe pushes b pawn down the board, get a queen himself, some counterplay, trying desperately, but it is to no avail. Jan plays king to g4, we get rook takes b2, and now after rook to h6, Ding Lirean resigns this game. Now you're probably wondering again, why resign here? The reason is very simple. If you play a move like b4 trying to get your pawn down the board, white can play king to f5, and after pawn takes pawn, rook h8 check, king f7, there's knight g5, which is simply checkmate. If you try to go king g8, for example, now I can go king g6, just going to push the pawn because the knight covers this pawn at f2, so you can't capture, and once again it's over. d5 f7, king f8 check, king e7 f8 queen, and white wins the game as well. And there's really nothing else you can do. You can play d5, but after takes again against a player of Nepo's caliber with king g5, the rook and the pawn and the knight coordinating, white is simply going to win. So there really is nothing you can do here, which is why Ding resigns this game. And with this epic victory in game number 5 of the match, Jan Nepomniachtchi takes a 3-2 lead over Ding Lirean. And I said it before, but I really feel like this turns the tide completely the other way. After the first 2 games where Jan was pressing, got a win and a draw, it felt like Ding was really struggling. Then Ding draws the third game very smoothly with the black pieces, and in round 4 he wins an excellent game in the English. But now in game number 5 he loses in another Spanish, and it's, or not another because it's the first time he's lost with black in the match. Nonetheless, he loses in the Spanish here, and with that Jan takes a lead 3-2. Big pendulum swing back the other direction. We will see tomorrow if Ding can strike back. I will say that at this point I think it's very likely that Nepo is going to win the match. I know people are going to critique me, and of course if Ding comes back everyone's going to laugh at me, but nonetheless I do feel that having seen these first 5 games, Nepo seems to have the clearly superior preparation. He definitely seems to be handling the nerves better for the most part, other than that one moment the other day when he started playing 5 or 6 moves instantly and of course lost that game. But overall I would say what I've seen so far makes me feel very confident that Nepo is going to win. Once again, this is not financial advice to say that you should bet on Nepomniachtchi, but I do think it's very likely that Nepomniachtchi is going to win the match at this point based on what I have seen. But again, only 5 games gone. We have 9 more games to go. At any rate, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below, and we'll be back very soon with more coverage of the World Chess Championship here on YouTube. See you guys. Bye.